The room was dark, empty, silent except for the sound of Rita's breathing. She knelt on the cold stone floor of her house in Roccaporina, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Outside, the Italian countryside slept. Inside, a widow wrestled with God. Her husband Paolo was dead, murdered just weeks ago by men who hadn't forgotten his violent past. Her two sons, barely old enough to grow beards, had sworn an oath. They would avenge their father. They would kill. And Rita knew what that meant. She had spent 18 years transforming a brutal man into a gentle one through nothing but prayer and patience. She had saved Paolo's soul just before death took him. Now her sons wanted to throw their own souls away for revenge. So she prayed, but not the prayer you might expect. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "I am asking you for something no mother should ever ask. My sons swear they will kill. They will become murderers to avenge their father. So I beg you, take them from me. Let them die before they spill blood. Let me bury them innocent rather than watch them damn their souls." Silence answered her. But Rita had prayed impossible prayers before. She had married a man they called the Fierce Lion and watched him transform. She had been marked by heaven from birth when white bees deposited honey on her lips instead of stings. Years later, she would bear a bleeding wound on her forehead for 15 years, a wound she had asked for, a wound that connected her to Christ's suffering. And one winter day, when she lay dying, someone would find a rose blooming in the snow, just for her. This is the story of a woman who sacrificed everything, her dreams, her family, her body, and discovered that with God, even the impossible becomes possible. But the price was unimaginable. To understand why Rita prayed for her sons to die, we must go back to a small village in the mountains of Umbria, back to a child marked by heaven from birth. Welcome to Catholic Hearts. Subscribe now to discover the extraordinary and inspiring stories that shape our Catholic faith. The year was 1381. In the small village of Roccaporina, nestled in the foothills of Mount Ricino in Umbria, Italy, a couple named Antonio Lotti and Amata Ferri had been waiting for 12 years. Waiting for a child that never came. They prayed. They hoped. They endured the whispers of neighbors who wondered if their marriage was somehow cursed. Then, after 12 long years, Amata finally conceived. And when the child was born, a girl, they named her Margherita. Margaret, a flower that blooms even in difficult soil. 4 days later, the family brought little Margherita to the church in Cascia for her baptism. It was a simple ceremony, the kind performed countless times in countless villages across medieval Italy. Nothing about that day suggested that this child would one day be called the saint of the impossible. But the next morning, something extraordinary happened. Amata had placed baby Margherita in her cradle near an open window to sleep. When the parents came to check on her, they froze. White bees, dozens of them, were flying around the infant, landing on her lips, crawling across her face. But the child wasn't crying. She was peaceful, sleeping soundly. And the bees weren't stinging. They were depositing something. Honey. Antonio moved to brush them away, but Amata stopped him. There was something too strange, too deliberate about the scene, as if heaven itself was marking this child. A farmer working nearby saw what was happening and rushed over, believing the child was in danger. He waved his arms frantically to scatter the insects. As he did, he noticed something impossible, a deep cut on his hand. A wound he'd received hours earlier while working had suddenly closed. The flesh was smooth, as if the injury had never existed. The bees eventually flew away. The baby continued sleeping, and the parents looked at each other with a mixture of wonder and fear. Their daughter had been marked. But for what? As Margherita, who would later be known simply as Rita, grew older, the answer seemed clear. This child was different. While other children played in the streets of Roccaporina, Rita sought silence. While others were content with ordinary prayers, Rita was drawn to the passion of Christ with an intensity that unsettled even her devout parents. Antonio and Amata were exemplary Catholics who taught their daughter well, but they couldn't fully explain the fire that burned in her young heart. Rita asked them for something unusual, a space in their home where she could pray alone. They gave her the most distant room in the house, barely more than a closet, and there, Rita would disappear for hours, meditating, praying, forging a spirituality that would sustain her through unimaginable trials. Even as a girl, Rita knew what she wanted. She wanted to belong entirely to God. She wanted to become a nun, to live a life of prayer and contemplation, sheltered from the violent, chaotic world outside those monastery walls. It was a beautiful dream, a pure dream, but her parents, growing old and afraid for their daughter's future, had other plans. And those plans would plunge Rita into a living nightmare. Medieval Italy was not kind to unmarried women. Without a husband, a woman had few options and even fewer protections. Rita's parents knew this, and as their own health declined, they grew desperate to ensure their daughter would be cared for after they died. So, following the custom of the time, they arranged a marriage. The groom's name was Paolo Mancini. He was an officer commander of the garrison at Collegicone, a man of some standing in the region. He was also called Fiero Leone, the fierce lion, because of his impetuous, violent temper. Paolo was known for his brutality, his quick anger, his willingness to settle disputes with his fists or worse. This was the man Rita's aging parents chose for their devout, gentle daughter. When Rita learned of the arrangement, her heart must have broken. Everything she had prayed for, everything she had dreamed of, was being taken away. No convent, no life of prayer. Instead, marriage to a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm. But Rita, who had learned obedience to God in that small prayer room, chose obedience to her parents, even when it cost her everything, even when she knew what awaited her. The wedding took place, and thus began Rita's martyrdom. The early years of Rita's marriage were a calvary. Paolo's temper, which had been merely a reputation before, became Rita's daily reality. She endured his violent moods, his harsh words, the constant tension of living with a man whose anger could explode without warning. But Rita didn't just endure. She had a strategy. While other wives might have responded to cruelty with bitterness or revenge, Rita responded with something far more radical: prayer. Fervent, ceaseless, desperate prayer. She prayed for Paolo's conversion. She prayed for his soul, and she joined her suffering to Christ's suffering, offering her tears and pain as a sacrifice. She fasted. She performed secret penances. She refused to gossip about her husband to neighbors, refused to let bitterness take root in her heart. Instead, she chose patience, docility, trust in God's timing. It must have seemed futile. Year after year, Paolo remained the fierce lion. Year after year, Rita's prayers seemed to disappear into silence. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, something began to change. Paolo's rages became less frequent. His harsh words softened. The man who had terrorized his household began, gradually, to transform. Biographers would later note that his temperament changed substantially over the course of their marriage. The fierce lion was being tamed, not by force, but by the quiet, persistent love of a woman who refused to stop praying. And then, after years of suffering, Rita experienced something she had almost stopped believing possible: joy. She gave birth to twin sons, Giangiacomo Antonio and Paolo Maria, two healthy boys who became the center of her world. For a brief period, Rita's life almost resembled the peace she had once imagined. Paolo was gentler. The boys were growing. The house in Roccaporina, which had once been filled with tension, now echoed with children's laughter. It wasn't the life Rita had chosen, but it had become a life she could love. And then, in an instant, everything shattered. Paolo was murdered, assassinated by men who remembered his violent past, men who had been waiting years for revenge. Political feuds in medieval Italy rarely ended cleanly, and Paolo's history had caught up with him, just as he had finally become the man Rita had prayed for. Rita received the news with devastating grace. She publicly forgave her husband's killers. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that revenge only births more revenge, that violence only breeds more violence. But her sons didn't understand. They were young, filled with rage and grief. And their uncles, Paolo's brothers, whispered in their ears, stoking the flames of vengeance. Giangiacomo and Paolo Maria swore an oath. They would hunt down their father's killers. They would make them pay. They would avenge the fierce lion. And Rita, hearing this, felt her world collapse a second time. She had spent 18 years saving Paolo's soul. Now her sons were about to throw away their own. Which brings us back to that dark room. To Rita on her knees. To the prayer no mother should ever pray. The choice before Rita was impossible. Truly impossible. If she did nothing, her sons would become killers. They would murder their father's assassins, stain their hands with blood, and, if the church's teachings meant anything, risk eternal damnation. An earthly revenge in exchange for heavenly loss. If she stopped them physically, they would simply wait until she couldn't watch them anymore. The oath had been sworn. The uncles were encouraging them. The pressure of family honor in medieval Italy was immense. Rita could beg. She could plead. She could lock them in their rooms. But she couldn't change their hearts. Only God could do that. So she prayed. Not a safe prayer. Not a comfortable prayer. Not even a prayer most priests would have advised. Lord, I would rather see my sons dead than see them become murderers. I would rather lose them to you than lose them to hell. Take them, if that is what it requires. Let me bury them innocent. It's hard to overstate how agonizing this prayer must have been. These were her children, the boys she had nursed, raised, loved. They were all she had left after Paolo's death. They were her future, her comfort, her joy, and she was asking God to kill them. But Rita understood something that cuts against every human instinct. This life is not the last word. The stakes were higher than mere earthly happiness. Her sons' souls, their eternal souls, were in danger. And if the choice was between a long life ending in damnation or a short life ending in grace, Rita knew which she had to choose. She was, in a sense, like Abraham on Mount Moriah. Except Abraham was commanded to sacrifice his son. Rita was volunteering hers. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly, mysteriously, both Giangiacomo and Paolo Maria fell ill. The sickness progressed quickly. Medieval medicine could do nothing. And as the boys lay dying, something miraculous happened. The rage left them. The oath of vengeance dissolved. And before they drew their final breaths, both sons forgave their father's killers. They died in peace. They died in grace. They died innocent. Rita got what she prayed for. But the cost was everything. She buried her husband. She buried her sons. Her parents had already passed years before. At barely 40 years old, Rita was utterly, completely alone. The house in Roccaporina stood empty. The rooms where her children had laughed were silent. The bed she had shared with Paolo was cold. And in that crushing, suffocating loneliness, an old dream began to whisper again. She had wanted to be a nun since childhood. That path had been stolen from her by an arranged marriage. But now, there was nothing keeping her in the world. No husband, no children, no ties. Rita looked toward Cascia, toward the monastery of Saint Mary Magdalene, where the Augustinian sisters lived. She had been denied that life once. Perhaps now, finally, God would open the door. But nothing with Rita was ever simple. And what seemed like an obvious next step would prove to be another impossible test. The Augustinian sisters of Saint Mary Magdalene were known for their piety and strict observance of the rule. Rita approached them with hope, presenting herself as a candidate for religious life. The answer was no. The convent's rule was clear. They did not accept widows. Only young, unmarried women could enter. Rita had been married. She had borne children. According to their regulations, she was ineligible. Rita persisted. She explained that she had always wanted religious life, that circumstances, not choice, had led her to marriage. She was a widow now, free of obligations. Surely an exception could be made. The answer was no. There was another problem, the sisters explained. Rita's late husband had a violent history. His murder had been motivated by old feuds, by grudges that still simmered among the families of Roccaporina and Cascia. The Mancini family and the families of Paolo's killers were still at odds. Allowing Rita to enter would risk bringing those conflicts into the peaceful walls of the monastery. The rule existed for a reason. The peace of the community had to be protected. No exceptions. Rita returned home. She prayed. She fasted. She wept. And then she went back to the convent. The answer was no. 3 times, the Sisters of Saint Mary Magdalene refused Rita's request. 3 times, the door remained closed. And for most people, that would have been the end of the story. Most people would have accepted that God's will, apparently, was for them to remain in the world. But Rita had prayed impossible prayers before, and she wasn't done yet. If the obstacle was the feud between families, then Rita would remove the obstacle. She spent months mediating between the Mancinis and the families of Paolo's murderers. She encouraged public gestures of reconciliation. She facilitated meetings. She prayed for peace not just in heaven, but here, in the streets and homes of Roccaporina. And slowly, impossibly, the families agreed to reconcile. Public forgiveness was declared. The feud, at least officially, was laid to rest. Rita returned to the convent a 4th time. She explained what had been accomplished. The obstacle had been removed. The danger of violence was resolved. Surely now, but the rules still forbade widows. And the sisters, though impressed by Rita's peacemaking, could not change centuries of tradition. Rita went home. She climbed to her favorite place of prayer, a rocky outcrop high above Roccaporina, known as Lo Scoglio della Preghiera, the Rock of Prayer. There, under the stars, she poured out her heart to God. It was the night of 1407, or perhaps 1413. Sources differ. What they agree on is this: something impossible happened. According to tradition, as Rita prayed on that mountain, 3 figures appeared before her. She recognized them instantly. Saint Augustine, founder of the Augustinian order, Saint John the Baptist, the great prophet, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentino, the Augustinian preacher she deeply admired. They spoke no words, but Rita understood. They had come for her. What happened next defies natural explanation. Rita felt herself lifted, transported through the night air. The rocky mountain disappeared. The stars blurred. And when she opened her eyes, she was standing inside the monastery of Saint Mary Magdalene, inside the walls, behind the locked doors. When the sisters arrived for morning prayer, they found Rita kneeling in the chapel. The doors were still locked from the inside. The walls were intact. There was no earthly way she could have entered. The sisters could have expelled her. They could have called it witchcraft or deception. But instead, they looked at Rita's face, still lit with the wonder of what had happened, and they understood. Heaven wanted this woman inside these walls, and heaven would not be denied. Rita was admitted to the community. After years of rejection, after 4 refusals, after an earthly impossibility, the door finally opened. Not because the rules changed, but because God wrote his own rule. Rita had finally entered the convent she'd dreamed of since childhood. But she was about to discover that holiness doesn't mean the end of suffering. Sometimes, it means choosing even more. Rita threw herself into religious life with the same intensity she had brought to everything else. She wanted to be perfect, not out of pride, but out of love for the God who had brought her through so much, love for the Christ whose passion had sustained her through her darkest years. She was the first to rise from morning prayer, the last to leave the chapel at night. Her cell was Spartan, a simple bed, a crucifix on the wall, a few images depicting Christ's suffering. Nothing else. She needed nothing else. Rita fasted constantly. She performed penances that even the other sisters found extreme. And yet there was nothing harsh or judgmental about her. The other nuns loved her. She had a gift for listening, for offering comfort, for radiating a warmth that drew troubled souls to her like moths to a flame. But the prioress, the mother superior of the monastery, saw something in Rita that needed testing. Rita was obedient, yes. But was her obedience complete? Was it perfect? Or was there still, somewhere deep in her soul, a kernel of self-will? So the prioress gave Rita an unusual task. In the monastery garden, there was a plant, a stick, really completely dead, dried out, lifeless. It had been cut down and left to rot. The prioress pointed to this dead plant and said, "Water this." Every day, Rita didn't ask why. She didn't point out the obvious futility of the task. She simply bowed her head and said, "Yes, Mother." And so, every single day, Rita carried water to that dead plant in the garden. The other sisters watched with confusion. Some whispered that the prioress was being needlessly harsh. Others thought Rita was being made a fool. Why water something that would never grow? But Rita didn't care about their whispers. Obedience, she understood, wasn't about logic. It wasn't about results. It was about trust. Trust that God knew what he was doing, even when the task seemed pointless. Especially when it seemed pointless. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And Rita kept watering. Then, one morning, a sister working in the garden gasped. She ran to get the prioress. The other nuns gathered around the dead plant. Because it wasn't dead anymore. Green shoots were emerging from the dry wood. Leaves were unfurling. The plant, which by all natural laws should have remained a stick forever, was alive. It grew. It flourished. It bore fruit. According to tradition, it was a grapevine. And that vine, they say, still exists in Cascia. 5 centuries later, a living testament to the power of perfect obedience. The prioress said nothing. She didn't need to. Every sister in that monastery understood the lesson. When we obey completely, when we trust without reservation, even dead things can come alive. Even impossible things become possible. Rita had passed the test, but now she was about to ask for something that would make watering a dead plant seem trivial. She was about to ask God for a gift that most people would consider a curse. She was about to ask to suffer. And in 1432, God would grant her request in a way that would horrify and isolate her for the rest of her life. Rita spent hours before the crucifix. It was her favorite place in the monastery, a quiet alcove where an image of Christ crucified hung on the wall. She would kneel there, sometimes for so long that her knees went numb, and meditate on every detail of his passion. The crown of thorns pressed into his skull, the nails through his hands and feet, the spear wound in his side, the agony of suffocation as his body hung, suspended between heaven and earth. Other sisters prayed before this same crucifix and saw an object of devotion. Rita saw something different. She saw a mirror, an invitation, a challenge. And as she contemplated these sufferings day after day, month after month, a desire began to grow in her heart. A strange, terrifying desire that she barely dared to articulate, even to herself. She wanted to share in it. She wanted to bear, even for a moment, even in the smallest fraction, the pain that Christ had endured for her. It wasn't morbid. It wasn't self-destructive. It was love, the kind of love that can't remain at a distance, that refuses to be comfortable while the beloved suffers. Rita had spent her entire life watching people suffer. Her husband's violence, her son's rage, the feuds that tore families apart. She understood suffering intimately, but she had never understood Christ's suffering. Not really, not in her flesh. So she began to pray a dangerous prayer. Lord, let me share in your suffering. Let me carry a piece of your cross. Let me understand, not just intellectually but physically, what you endured for love of me. Let one thorn from your crown pierce my flesh, so I may know what you bore for my salvation. She prayed this for months. The prayer became a constant undercurrent to her life in the monastery. While she performed her duties, while she attended the divine office, while she lay in bed at night, unable to sleep, the prayer was there. Persistent, relentless. The other sisters didn't know about this private prayer, this secret longing burning in Rita's heart. They saw only the devoted nun who was first to rise, last to leave the chapel, who fasted and performed penances with a fervor that bordered on extreme. But God heard, and in 1432, on a day that began like any other, he answered. Rita was alone in the chapel that afternoon. The other sisters were occupied with their work, some in the kitchen, others in the infirmary, others copying manuscripts in the scriptorium. The monastery was quiet, the way Rita liked it. Just her and the crucifix. She knelt on the cold stone floor. Her knees ached. They always did after so many hours, but she ignored the discomfort. It was nothing compared to what she was contemplating. She fixed her eyes on Christ's face, on the crown of thorns digging into his brow, and she prayed her prayer again. Let me share your suffering, Lord. Just one thorn. Just one. Her meditation went deeper than it ever had before. It was as if the boundary between her soul and Christ's suffering had dissolved. The chapel seemed to fade. The stones, the candles, the distant sounds of the monastery, all of it receded. There was only Christ, only the cross, only the thorns. Rita felt herself drawn into the passion, no longer an observer, but a participant. She was there, somehow, not watching the crucifixion from a safe distance of centuries, but present. She saw the soldiers. She heard the hammering. She smelled the blood, and then she felt it. Sharp, searing, unbearable. A pain unlike anything she'd ever known lanced through her forehead. Not a dull ache, not a gradual onset, but sudden, violent, as though one of the thorns from Christ's crown had detached itself, crossed the centuries, and driven into her skull. Rita gasped. Her hands flew to her forehead. She felt wetness. Warm, sticky, blood. She pulled her hands away and stared at them. Her fingers were red. The blood was running down her face now, dripping onto her habit. The pain was so intense, she could barely breathe. It felt as though her skull was being split open from the inside. One of the sisters, passing the chapel on her way to Vespers, heard Rita's gasp and rushed inside. What she saw made her freeze in the doorway. Rita was kneeling before the crucifix, blood streaming down her face. Her hands pressed her forehead, her body shaking. But her eyes were open, fixed on the corpus, and there was something in them that wasn't pain. Or not only pain, there was awe, wonder, even joy. The sister ran to get the prioress. Within minutes, several nuns had gathered. They tried to clean the wound to see what had caused it. There was no external injury they could identify. No cut, no abrasion, no sign of any physical trauma. The blood was coming from deep within the skin, from a wound that seemed to have opened from the inside out. When Rita finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "It's a thorn," she said. "From his crown. I asked for it, and he gave it to me." The sisters exchanged glances. Stigmata were rare, but not unheard of in church history. Saint Francis of Assisi had received the wounds in his hands, feet, and side. Saint Catherine of Siena had experienced mystical wounds. But this, a single thorn wound in the forehead, was unusual, specific, intimate. They helped Rita to her cell. They bandaged the wound as best they could. They prayed over her, and then they waited to see if the bleeding would stop. It didn't. Days passed. The wound continued to bleed. Not constantly. Sometimes it would slow to a trickle, sometimes barely anything at all. But it never fully closed. It never healed. Every morning, Rita would wake to find her bandages stained red. Every evening, she would replace them before sleep. The pain was constant, a throbbing, pulsing ache that never entirely went away. Sometimes it would intensify, sharp jabs that made her wince and clutch her head. Other times it would settle into a dull background agony that colored everything she did. Rita accepted it. She had asked for this. She had prayed for this. And now that she had it, she wouldn't complain. This was her gift, her participation in the mystery of the cross. This was union with Christ in the most literal sense possible. But then, after several weeks, something worse than pain began. The wound began to smell. At first, it was subtle, a faint, unpleasant odor that Rita noticed when she changed her bandages. She tried washing the wound more carefully, using herbs from the monastery garden that the sisters used for other infections. But the smell didn't go away. It got stronger. Within a month, it was unmistakable. The wound wasn't just bleeding anymore. It was festering, putrefying. A foul, sickly sweet stench of decay emanated from Rita's forehead, so powerful that it could be detected from across a room. The other sisters tried to hide their reactions. They were compassionate women, devoted to God and to each other. But the human body has limits. The smell was so intense that some sisters would gag when they came near Rita. Others would hold their breath, try not to let their discomfort show. A few, despite their best intentions, would turn away. Rita saw it all. She felt the distance growing between herself and the community she loved. She watched as sisters who had once sought her counsel now avoided her. She noticed the relieved expressions when she left a room, the way conversations would pause when she approached. It was a new kind of suffering. Physical pain was one thing, but this social death, this exile within her own community was something else entirely. The prioress, a kind woman who genuinely cared for Rita, faced an impossible situation. The rule of St. Augustine emphasized community, fraternal love, shared life. But how could the community function normally when one member's presence was physically unbearable? After much prayer and consultation, the prioress made a decision. For the good of the community, for basic hygiene, and frankly for Rita's own dignity, she would be given a separate cell. Not as punishment, but as necessity. A room was prepared in a distant wing of the monastery. It was small, austere, just a bed, a crucifix, a small table. A window looked out over the Umbrian countryside, but Rita wouldn't see many visitors through that window. Rita moved her few possessions without complaint. She understood. She had asked to share Christ's suffering, and she was learning that Christ's suffering included rejection, isolation, the experience of being someone others couldn't bear to be near. The cell door closed, and for the first time since entering the monastery, Rita was truly alone. This would be her life now. Meals brought to her door, prayer in solitude, the divine office chanted by herself instead of with the community. The wound on her forehead bleeding and stinking, day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. One thing to pray for suffering in a moment of spiritual fervor. It's quite another to actually suffer. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Most people would break. Most people would beg God to take it away, would question whether they'd made a terrible mistake, would wonder if this was divine punishment rather than divine gift. But Rita didn't break. She had been forged in fires before. The fire of an abusive marriage, the fire of burying her entire family, the fire of being rejected from religious life. This was just another fire, and like gold in the crucible, she trusted that something pure was being refined. She accepted the wound as what it was, a gift, a grace, a participation in the mystery of the cross, an opportunity to unite her small, finite suffering to Christ's infinite suffering. And so Rita lived, in isolation, in pain, with a wound that bled and stank and never, ever healed. The first year passed, then the second, the third. The wound showed no signs of closing. The isolation showed no signs of ending. And Rita, in her lonely cell, discovered something profound, that suffering, when united to Christ's suffering, has a strange kind of sweetness. Not pleasure, never that, but meaning, purpose, a sense that the pain wasn't being wasted, wasn't pointless, but was somehow contributing to the redemption of the world. She was living the Passion. Every day, every hour, every moment that wound bled, Christ bled with her. Every moment she was isolated, Christ was isolated with her. She was in the Garden of Gethsemane. She was on Calvary. She was in the tomb. And like Christ, she trusted that resurrection was coming. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. But she trusted. Years passed. The wound bled on. And Rita waited, in her cell, for whatever God had planned next. 14 years. That's how long Rita carried the wound before anything changed. 14 years of blood. 14 years of pain. 14 years of isolation in that small cell, watching the seasons turn through her window while the monastery lived its life without her. People often speak romantically about mystical union with Christ. They imagine ecstasy, visions, supernatural consolations. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes mystics experience extraordinary graces that lift them beyond ordinary human suffering. But sometimes, often, mystical union looks like this: a woman alone in a cell, changing bloody bandages, enduring pain that never stops, carrying a wound that never heals. Rita's life in those years was marked by routine. She would wake at dawn for lauds, praying alone in her cell while the community chanted together in the choir. She would receive her simple meals through the door: bread, vegetables, water. She would spend hours in prayer, contemplating the crucifix on her wall. She would perform small penances, additional fasts, mortifications that no one else knew about. The wound was her constant companion. Some days it bled more, some days less. Some days the pain was manageable, other days it was excruciating. The smell never went away. Rita had long since stopped trying to mask it with herbs or perfumes. This was her reality. This was her cross. The other sisters, to their credit, didn't forget about her. The prioress would visit occasionally, bringing news from the outside world, checking on Rita's physical and spiritual state. A few sisters, the ones with stronger constitutions, would brave the smell to sit with Rita, to talk, to pray together. But these visits were brief. Well-intentioned, but brief. Most of the time, Rita was alone. Just her and God. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was what she had been praying for all along, even if she hadn't realized it. Complete abandonment to God. Complete dependence on God. Nothing between her soul and her Creator except this wound, this pain, this offering. She thought often about her past life, about Paolo and his transformation, about her sons and the impossible prayer that saved their souls, about the years of waiting to enter religious life, about the miraculous entrance through locked doors. Her whole life had been a series of impossibilities made possible, and now she was living another one, enduring what shouldn't be endurable, surviving what would break most people, finding meaning in suffering that seemed meaningless. The monastery continued its rhythms around her. Seasons changed. New novices entered and took their vows. Older sisters died and were buried in the cemetery. The bell tower rang its hours. The garden produced its vegetables. The wine was made and stored. Life went on, and in her isolated cell, Rita went on too, bleeding, praying, suffering, offering. 14 years, 5,110 days, give or take. Over 120,000 hours of pain. How do you count suffering that never stops? How do you measure a cross that you carry every single moment? You don't. You simply carry it, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, one breath at a time. And then, in 1446, something changed. News reached Cascia that sent ripples of excitement through the Augustinian order. Nicholas of Tolentino, the great preacher, the wonder worker, the holy friar who had died over a century earlier, was being canonized. Pope Eugene IV himself would preside over the ceremony in Rome. It would be one of the most important celebrations in the order's history. Pilgrims were already preparing. From monasteries and convents across Italy, Augustinians were organizing groups to travel to Rome. The canonization would take place in St. Peter's Basilica with thousands in attendance. It would be magnificent, historic, a moment no devoted Augustinian would want to miss. When Rita heard the news, something stirred in her heart. A longing, a desire she had almost forgotten she could feel. St. Nicholas of Tolentino had been one of her patrons. One of the 3 saints who had appeared to her on that miraculous night years ago, who had transported her through the air and deposited her inside the locked monastery. She owed him a debt of gratitude. She loved him, and she desperately wanted to be present for his canonization. But how? How could she possibly go? She couldn't even attend communal prayer without driving her sisters away. How could she travel for days on dusty roads? How could she stay in crowded pilgrim hostels? How could she stand in a packed basilica, surrounded by thousands of people, with this wound on her forehead that announced itself to everyone within breathing distance? It was impossible, just another impossibility in a life full of them. But Rita had never let impossibility stop her before. She went to see the prioress. It must have taken courage to leave her cell, to walk through the corridors where sisters would turn away at her approach. But she did it. She requested an audience. And when the prioress received her, try not to breathe too deeply, Rita made her request. "Mother, I would like permission to join the pilgrimage to Rome for the canonization of Saint Nicholas." The prioress stared at her. Surely she had misheard. Surely Rita couldn't be serious. "Sister Rita," she said gently, "you know that's not possible. The wound, the smell, you couldn't travel. The other pilgrims wouldn't be able to endure it. And you yourself, 14 years of this suffering have weakened you. The journey would be too much. Rita nodded. She had expected this response. But she didn't argue. She simply said, I understand, Mother. But if it is God's will, He will make a way, as He always has. She returned to her cell, and she prayed, not demanding, not bargaining, not trying to manipulate God into giving her what she wanted. Simply asking, simply offering. If it was God's will for her to witness Nicholas's canonization, He would provide. If not, she would accept that too. The night before the pilgrimage was scheduled to depart, Rita was preparing for bed. She had already resigned herself to staying behind. The other sisters were excitedly packing their bags, talking about the journey, speculating about what Rome would be like. Rita had offered her prayers for their safe travel and decided to spend the days of their absence in additional fasting and prayer. But before she extinguished her candle, she touched her forehead. It was habit by now, checking the bandage, seeing if it needed changing before sleep. Her fingers met smooth skin. Rita froze. She touched again, more carefully. The bandage was still there, but underneath, the wound was gone. She pulled off the bandage with trembling hands. In the candlelight, she could see her reflection in the small bronze mirror on her table. Her forehead was whole, smooth, clean, no wound, no blood, no crust of dried infection, and no smell. The putrid odor that had been her constant companion for 14 years had vanished as completely as the wound itself. Rita sank to her knees. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry or shout. So she did all three, in turns, in that small cell where no one could hear her. The wound was gone. After 14 years, God had healed her. Not gradually, not through medical treatment, but instantly, miraculously, the night before she needed it to be healed. She barely slept that night. At dawn, she went to the prioress's cell and knocked. When the prioress opened the door, ready to tell Rita one more time that the pilgrimage was impossible, she stopped mid-sentence. Rita's forehead was unmarked. Clean. Perfect. Mother, Rita said quietly, I believe God has given us permission. The prioress touched Rita's forehead gently, as if expecting the wound to reappear at any moment. But the skin remained whole, and there was no smell, nothing but the faint scent of the herbs Rita had used to wash that morning. You may go, the prioress whispered. God be with you, Sister Rita. The journey to Rome took several days. Rita traveled with the other Augustinian sisters from Cascia, and for the first time in 14 years, she walked among people without seeing them turn away. She felt the sun on her face, really felt it, without the constant distraction of pain. She smelled the flowers beside the road, tasted the simple meals at the hostels, heard the excited chatter of pilgrims from across Italy. It was like being resurrected, like stepping out of a tomb into sunlight. Rome was overwhelming. The city was crowded with pilgrims for the canonization. Thousands of people from across Christendom had come to witness Pope Eugene declare Nicholas of Tolentino a saint. The streets were packed. The inns were full. The churches rang with constant masses and Te Deums. And Rita walked through it all, anonymous in the crowd, just another Augustinian sister among hundreds. No one stared at her. No one turned away. She was normal, ordinary, invisible in the best possible way. The canonization itself took place in St. Peter's Basilica. Rita had never seen anything like it. The massive nave, the soaring columns, the ornate altar, the Pope in his ceremonial vestments, the cardinals and bishops in their formal regalia, the choirs singing hymns that seemed to rise all the way to heaven. And when Pope Eugene IV pronounced the formula of canonization, when he declared Nicholas of Tolentino a saint of the Catholic Church, Rita wept. She wept for Nicholas, her patron and protector. She wept for the Augustinian order in this moment of glory. She wept for herself, that God had allowed her to be here to witness this after 14 years of isolation. It was one of the most beautiful days of her life. The pilgrimage stayed in Rome for several more days, visiting other shrines, attending masses, praying at the tombs of the apostles. And Rita savored every moment, every conversation with fellow pilgrims. Every meal shared in community. Every hour of simply being present with others without causing discomfort. She knew it wouldn't last. Deep in her heart, she knew this was a gift, a brief respite, a taste of normalcy. But it wasn't permanent. The wound would return. It had to, because she had chosen it, because it was her cross, because this was her path to union with Christ. The pilgrimage began its journey back to Cascia. The road was long, the days hot, but Rita barely noticed. She was storing up these memories like treasures, knowing they would have to sustain her through whatever came next. And when they finally arrived back at the monastery, when Rita knelt in prayer in the chapel before returning to her cell, she felt it. Sharp, searing, familiar. The pain lanced through her forehead exactly as it had 14 years earlier. She touched the spot and felt wetness. When she pulled her hand away, her fingers were red. The wound had returned. Rita looked up at the crucifix, the same crucifix before which she had prayed for this wound in the first place. And she smiled. Not a happy smile exactly, but a knowing one, a peaceful one. "Thank you," she whispered, "for Rome, for those few days, for letting me see that you could heal me whenever you chose. And thank you for trusting me to carry this cross a little longer." She walked back to her isolated cell. She resumed her routine, the bleeding, the pain, the smell that would once again drive people away. But something had changed. Rita had been given a profound gift in those few days. God had demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that he could heal her at any moment. The wound remained not because he couldn't remove it, but because she had chosen it. And he was honoring her choice. He was trusting her with this suffering. He was partnering with her in the work of redemption. 7 more years. That's how long the wound would bleed after Rita's return from Rome. 7 more years of isolation. 7 more years of pain. But Rita carried it differently now. Not with resignation, but with purpose. Not with mere endurance, but with joy. Because she knew, truly knew, that her suffering mattered. That every drop of blood, every moment of pain, every day of isolation was united to Christ's sacrifice. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was meaningless. And in her lonely cell, far from the community, but somehow more connected to Christ than ever, Rita continued her hidden ministry of suffering. Day after day, year after year, until her body, worn out by decades of penance and pain, began to fail. The final chapter of her life was approaching, and it would be marked by signs as tender and impossible as the wound that had defined her for 21 years. The last 7 years of Rita's life were marked by relentless decline. The wound continued to bleed. Her body, weakened by decades of fasting and penance, began to fail. For the final 4 years, Rita was bedridden, unable to leave her cell. The pain was constant, the isolation complete, and yet Rita's faith never wavered. She had given everything to God, her dreams, her family, her health, and she trusted that he would not abandon her in the end. The sisters cared for her as best they could. They brought her food, though she ate little. They changed her bedding. They sat with her when they could bear the smell of the wound. And Rita, even in her suffering, radiated a peace that defied explanation. In January of 1447, a relative came to visit Rita. It was deep winter. Snow covered the hills of Umbria, blanketing Roccaporina in white. The cold was bitter, the kind that seeps into your bones and won't let go. When the visit was ending, the relative asked the question visitors always ask. "Is there anything I can bring you? Anything you need?" Rita smiled. "Could you bring me a rose from the garden of my old house in Roccaporina?" The relative froze. A rose? In January? With snow covering everything? Surely this was delirium, the confused request of a dying woman whose mind was slipping. But something, curiosity, perhaps, or divine inspiration, made the relative decide to check. After leaving the monastery, instead of going straight home, they took the path toward Rita's childhood home. Through the snow, up the hill, to the abandoned garden that hadn't been tended in years. And there, impossibly, in the middle of winter, amid the snow and ice, was a single rose. Not a bud struggling to open. A full, magnificent bloom, red as blood, perfect as if it were June instead of January. The relative carefully cut the rose and brought it back to Cascia. When they placed it in Rita's hands, her eyes filled with tears. She held it gently, breathing in its fragrance, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Because it was a love letter from God, a small, tender mercy that said, "I see you. I've always seen you, and I'm coming for you soon." Before the relative left, Rita made one more request. "Could you bring me 2 ripe figs from the same garden?" Figs. In winter, after roses in winter, the relative no longer questioned. They simply went back to Roccaporina, back to that impossible garden, and found 2 perfectly ripe figs hanging from a branch that should have been bare. They brought the figs to Rita. She thanked them quietly, a knowing smile on her lips. Rita understood what these signs meant. God was saying goodbye to his daughter, and he was doing it with flowers and fruit, with beauty and sweetness, with signs that defied nature itself. Spring came. Rita grew weaker. She asked for the sacrament of the sick, the church's final anointing for those approaching death. The priest came. The prayers were said. The holy oil was applied to her forehead, her hands, her feet. And on May 22nd, 1447, as evening fell over Cascia, Rita of Roccaporina took her last breath. She was 66 years old. She had been a wife, a mother, a widow, a nun. She had endured violence, buried her entire family, carried a bleeding wound for 21 years. And now, finally, her suffering was over. But the moment Rita died, something extraordinary happened. Multiple things, actually, simultaneously. The bells of the monastery began to ring. All of them, but no one was pulling the ropes. The bells swung and chimed of their own accord, announcing Rita's death to the entire city of Cascia. Black bees, thousands of them, swarmed into Rita's cell. Not the white bees of her infancy, but dark ones. They circled the room in a living cloud, then flew out the window and dispersed into the night. A fragrance filled the monastery. Not the stench of the wound, but the overwhelming scent of roses. Sweet, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. It poured from Rita's cell and spread through the corridors, so strong that sisters on the other side of the building could smell it. Light blazed from Rita's room. Not firelight or candlelight, but something brighter, purer, as if the sun itself had descended into that small cell. Sisters who saw it said, later, that it was like looking into heaven. And when they finally entered the cell to prepare Rita's body for burial, they found something that would astound the world. The wound on Rita's forehead, the festering, bleeding, putrid wound that had been her cross for 21 years, had closed. Not just healed, closed and sealed, with drops of blood still glistening on the skin, catching the supernatural light. The sisters washed Rita's body. They dressed her in clean robes. They laid her in state so the people of Cascia could pay their respects. And as they did, they noticed something else. Something that would perplex doctors and theologians for centuries. Rita's body wasn't decaying. Days passed, then weeks, and there was no smell of death, no signs of decomposition. The skin retained its color. The features remained peaceful, unchanged. It was as if Rita hadn't died at all, but merely fallen asleep. They eventually placed her body in a chapel, accessible to pilgrims. Years passed, decades, a century, and still, Rita's body remained incorrupt. When church authorities examined her in 1627, 180 years after her death, they found her perfectly preserved, the skin still supple, as if she had died only days before. Medical examinations in 1972 and 1997 confirmed the inexplicable preservation. The wound site on her forehead still showed evidence of the bone lesion. Her body, now mummified in the face, hands, and feet, lies in a glass reliquary in Cascia. 5 centuries after her death, pilgrims can still see Rita of Cascia, can still venerate the woman who proved that nothing is impossible with God. But the miracle wasn't just preservation. It was what came after: the recognition, the canonization, the worldwide devotion, the countless people who would come to call on Rita in their own impossible situations. For 180 years after Rita's death, her cult grew quietly. The people of Cascia venerated her. Pilgrims came to see her incorrupt body. Miracles were reported at her tomb, but official recognition from the church took time. In 1627, Pope Urban VIII declared Rita blessed, the step before sainthood. But it would take nearly 3 more centuries before the church would examine the evidence thoroughly enough to declare her a saint. The process required proof of miracles. 3, specifically, attributed to Rita's intercession after death. The church investigated rigorously. Doctors were consulted. Witnesses were questioned. The standards were high, and yet the evidence was overwhelming. The first miracle involved the sweet fragrance that emanated from Rita's incorrupt body. This wasn't natural preservation through embalming or environmental conditions. The body had never been properly treated for burial, and yet it not only remained intact, but exuded a perfume that defied explanation. The second miracle occurred in 1887. A young woman named Elizabeth Bergamini had been suffering from severe smallpox and had lost her vision. She had been staying at the convent in Cascia for 4 months, praying desperately for healing. One night, she asked for Rita's intercession. The next morning, Elizabeth woke to find both her smallpox and her blindness completely cured. Doctors who had examined her before confirmed the impossibility of such a sudden, total recovery. The third miracle involved a man named Cosmo Pellegrini. He suffered from chronic gastroenteritis and hemorrhoids, so severe that doctors had declared his condition incurable. In 1887, on his deathbed, Pellegrini had a vision of blessed Rita. She appeared to him and told him he would be healed. When he woke, the pain was gone. The symptoms had vanished completely. He lived many more years in perfect health. These 3 miracles, thoroughly investigated and verified, formed the foundation for Rita's canonization. On May 24, 1900, Pope Leo XIII declared Rita a saint before a massive crowd in St. Peter's Square. In the ceremony, Pope Leo XIII gave Rita a title that would define her legacy: Advocate of the Impossible. It was perfect. Rita had achieved the impossible again and again in her life. She had converted a violent husband. She had saved her son's souls through an agonizing prayer. She had entered a convent that wouldn't accept her. She had carried a supernatural wound for 21 years. She had demonstrated in every moment of her existence that God specializes in impossibilities. The title spread. Today, throughout the Catholic world, Rita of Cascia is invoked for impossible causes: marriages on the brink of collapse, terminal illnesses, desperate financial situations, relationships torn apart by violence or betrayal. Whenever someone faces a situation that seems hopeless, they turn to Rita because she knows what hopelessness feels like, and she knows that God is bigger than our hopelessness. Rita also became known as the patron saint of abuse victims, particularly women trapped in violent marriages. Her story resonates with countless people who live with the same fear and pain she endured. She shows them that survival is possible, that transformation is possible, that even the most broken situations can be redeemed. She's the patron of difficult marriages and marital problems, of widows who must rebuild their lives alone, of sick people carrying crosses they never asked for, of anyone who has lost children, whether to death or to choices that break a parent's heart. In Cascia, the devotion to Rita never waned. In the 20th century, a massive basilica was constructed to accommodate the throngs of pilgrims. The house where Rita was born in Roccaporina has been preserved. The monastery where she lived is now a museum and pilgrimage site. Millions visit every year, coming from every corner of the globe. And the white bees? They never left. To this day, a colony of white bees, stingless bees, lives near the walls of the basilica in Cascia. They fly through a small opening in the wall and make their way to Rita's tomb. Beekeepers have examined them and confirmed their unique species. Scientists can't fully explain their behavior, but the faithful understand. They're a sign, a living reminder that Rita belongs to God, that she always has from the moment those bees deposited honey on an infant's lips in 1381. The symbolism is rich. In spiritual tradition, Bees represent transformation and intimacy with God. Honey represents sweetness, purity, and divine favor. Rita, whose life was marked by suffering and bitterness, was transformed into sweetness. Her relationship with God was so intimate, so profound, that even creation itself bears witness. Pope John Paul II, speaking at the centenary of Rita's canonization in 2000, summarized her life beautifully. He said Rita represented well the feminine genius, living it intensely in both physical and spiritual motherhood. She was an example not just of endurance, but of how to love radically, how to sacrifice intelligently, how to transform suffering into sanctity. Today, Rita's body still rests in its glass reliquary in Cascia. The face, hands, and feet are mummified but visible. The wound site on her forehead can still be seen. She measures 1 meter and 57 centimeters tall. After 5 centuries, she remains a testament to the impossible made possible. In 2010, in Santa Cruz, Brazil, the largest Catholic statue in the world was unveiled. It depicts Saint Rita of Cascia, standing 44 meters tall, arms outstretched, welcoming the desperate and the hopeless. It's a fitting tribute. Rita spent her life with arms outstretched, in prayer, in sacrifice, in love, and she's been doing the same from heaven for more than 5 centuries. When people pray to Rita, they're not praying to her because she had an easy life. They pray because she had an impossible life and she conquered it, because she faced violence and responded with patience, because she lost everything and still trusted God, because she carried a wound that wouldn't heal and never complained, because she demonstrates in the most visceral way possible that suffering can be transformed, that pain can have meaning, that even death is not the end. Rita of Cascia, the saint of the impossible. She earned that title through blood, tears, and unshakable faith. And for anyone facing their own impossible situation today, she stands as proof that nothing, absolutely nothing, is beyond God's power to redeem. When Rita knelt in that dark room in Roccaporina and prayed for her sons to die, she was living out a pattern that had defined her entire life. A pattern of sacrifice, but not meaningless sacrifice, not suffering for suffering's sake. Rita's life was marked by 3 great sacrifices, each one building on the last, each one preparing her for what came next. The first sacrifice was her dream. She wanted to be a nun from childhood, wanted to belong entirely to God, wanted a life of prayer and contemplation behind monastery walls. Instead, she was given an arranged marriage to a violent man. She sacrificed her dream, and in doing so, she learned something crucial, that obedience to God sometimes means accepting circumstances we didn't choose. That holiness isn't found only in convents, but in kitchens and bedrooms and places of pain. That transformation, whether of ourselves or others, requires long, patient, hidden work. Rita's marriage to Paolo became her first monastery, and through 18 years of prayer and sacrifice, she accomplished something many would call impossible. She converted him. The fierce lion became gentle. The violent man became, near the end, a man of peace. Her sacrifice bore fruit, not immediately, not easily, but genuinely. The second sacrifice was her family. When Paolo was murdered and her son swore revenge, Rita faced the most agonizing choice of her life. She could cling to her children, could hope that somehow their rage would fade, could pretend that everything would work out. Or she could love them enough to let them go, to pray the impossible prayer, to ask God to take them before they could damn themselves. She chose their souls over her own comfort. She chose eternity over time. She chose to bury them innocent rather than watch them become killers. And God, honoring her faith, answered that prayer. Her sons died in grace, forgiven and forgiving. Her sacrifice saved their souls, but the cost was total loneliness. No husband, no children, no parents, just Rita and God. The third sacrifice was her body. When she finally entered the monastery, when she finally achieved the dream she'd held since childhood, she didn't rest. She didn't coast. Instead, She asked God for more. She prayed to share in Christ's passion, to carry a piece of his cross, to understand, not intellectually but physically, what he had endured for love of humanity. And God said yes. For 21 years, Rita carried a wound on her forehead. For 21 years, she endured pain, isolation, and the stench of her own infected flesh. She sacrificed her health, her comfort, her very body, to be united with the crucified Christ. These three sacrifices, her dream, her family, her body, weren't random tragedies. They were progression. Each one stripped away something Rita loved, something she clung to, something that stood between her and total abandonment to God. And each time, Rita said yes. Not happily, not easily, but completely. Rita's life teaches us something profoundly uncomfortable, that holiness often requires the surrender of what we love most. Not because God is cruel, but because true love, the love that saves souls, sometimes demands impossible choices. Rita chose eternity over comfort, heaven over earth, the cross over ease. And here's the paradox, the mystery that defines her life and her legacy. She lost everything and gained everything. She buried her family and became mother to millions. She lived in isolation, and her name became known worldwide. She carried a wound that wouldn't heal and became a healer of impossible wounds. Saint Rosa of Lima once said, "Apart from the cross, there is no other ladder by which we may get to heaven." Rita of Cascia lived that truth. The cross wasn't something she endured reluctantly. It was something she chose again and again, knowing that it was the only path to resurrection. Today, when you face your own impossible situation, your own broken marriage, your own wayward child, your own unbearable suffering, remember Rita of Cascia. Remember that she stood where you stand. She felt what you feel. She faced choices that seemed to have no good answer. And she discovered what we all must learn, that with God, even the impossible becomes possible. Even death becomes life. Even thorns become roses. Even a wound that won't heal becomes a doorway to holiness. Rita of Cascia sacrificed everything. And in doing so, she gained eternity. She became a saint not because she avoided suffering, but because she embraced it. She became the advocate of the impossible not because her life was easy, but because it was impossible, and she conquered it through faith. Her body lies incorrupt in Cascia. The white bees still circle her tomb. The rose still blooms in winter. And millions of people, facing their own impossible situations, still whisper her name in prayer, because they know what Rita proved, that nothing is truly impossible with God. Thank you for watching. May the example of Saint Rita of Cascia inspire your own journey of faith, and may you discover, as she did, that nothing is truly impossible with God.